But one of the reasons I'm excited for the team next year is the defensive line. And I kind of want to get into this with the asterisk of this kind of being a position where I could be very right or I could be very wrong. And I think there's a lot of pieces in play here that we just don't quite know about yet. And I'm kind of betting on progressions, which I know is not something you always want to do. But just looking at kind of some of the opportunities that we have there and some of the contracts that are up and just the opportunities that we're going to have to try something different. So one of the first guys I want to talk about is AJ Vanessa, and he's coming into that third year of a player that is kind of a guy that was a little rough around the edges, but we bet on the physical tools and the coaching staff and who the player is as a person. And we've seen year 3 be such a big year for so many of these players that we've brought in. And, we're talking Josh Allen, Dawson Knox, Ed Oliver came on this year, Taron Johnson. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on of these players that, looked a little rough in their first couple of years and then just kind of burst onto the scene. And I think AJ Epinesa is kind of next in line to do that. And we saw flashes of it this past season. And I know we can specifically talk about the game he played against the Dolphins where he was just all over the place. For me this past season, there wasn't enough of the consistency. But if you can even get 10, 15% more of those flash plays, I think kind of with the progression of some of the other players and the fact that we like to run this rotation, that he could be a very effective player. And then opposite of him, kind of looking the youth aspect, Greg Rousseau. It was a pick in the draft last year that I was kind of back and forth on. And what I didn't really expect to see out of Greg Rousseau year 1 was kind of that high floor of being a run defender. And I think, not always having the splashiest plays and, rookie year double-digit sack numbers, I think he was quietly sneaky good for his rookie season, and we're talking a guy that had transitioned over to the position in college, 1-year starter. He took the 2020 year off for COVID, and kind of was coming into his rookie year being the first football that he's played in 2 years. So I was kind of expecting him to be more on the AJ Epinesa rookie year, kind of letting him dip his toes into the water. And he was thrust into a pretty considerable workload this year. And I think there's definitely some room for improvement, but I think the floor that we saw from him, it's an average starting NFL defensive end. But if he can keep working towards that ceiling, we might have really got somebody there. Talk about some of the other DNs. This is where some of the questions and opportunities come up for me. When you look at Jerry Hughes and Mario Addison, will one of them be back? Will they both be gone? I'm kind of leaning towards one of the two stays, and in my heart, it's got to be Jerry Hughes, right? The longest tenured Bill. Anybody who's been sticking around for his whole career throughout Buffalo knows, the Jerry Hughes we had at the beginning of the career. He was, taking bad penalties. He was a hothead. But when you look at his career with the Bills overall. He really turned into a very good player for us. He turned into just a great leader, and in particular for being a player that we traded Kelvin Shepard for. Kelvin Shepard he's already out of the league, and I believe he has a linebacking coach in Detroit, a linebacking coaching job in Detroit. So just kind of that longevity in the career that he was able to put together with the Bills. He's definitely a guy that if we could rework the contract a little bit, maybe give him a couple of years, he's still a pretty effective pass rusher. Not necessarily getting the numbers in the sacks, but the pressure that he can bring after the quarterback to force them into decisions and maybe flush them into some of these other players that are blossoming. Thinking Ed Oliver, Greg Rousseau. I think he still has value to the team. And then Mario Addison, who was a guy that honestly I wasn't too keen on having around when we were talking about this last offseason. But what do I know? He ends up leading the team in sacks and kind of took on that veteran mentor job and really working with these young guys. So I mean, if you can work out the money and it makes sense, I'm really okay with one or both of them coming back at kind of a team-friendly deal. They're both up there in age. Jerry Hughes, I personally want to see retire with the Bills. So I think it'll be interesting to see what shakes out there. The interior of the defensive line, I guess this is where I would say we have some needs to address. But also looking at, Star Lotulelei, who, if he didn't get the massive contract that he got to come to Buffalo, I think we might all be a little bit more okay with that. But in particular with him having the opt-out year and that kind of not affecting contract status, it's kind of just another year where it kind of hurts us to get rid of him. So I think he probably sticks around and in a reduced role, fine, I guess. But I think the guy that excites me here is Harrison Phillips, who I absolutely loved when we took Harrison Phillips in the draft. And not just who he is as a player, but who he is off the field. Just Walter Payton, Man of the Year nominee, finalist more than once, and just a seemingly great teammate, just an overall hard worker, and just battled some rough injuries and kind of getting right on the field. And in my opinion, towards the end of this, and I guess it happened on the field too, we saw him kind of eating away into Star's snaps and playing well as not just, that one tech, but he was really able to push the pocket. He was getting after the quarterback, kind of collapsing the pocket. And the next guy I want to talk about, Ed Oliver, they seem to really work well in tandem together. He's going to be Harrison Phillips will be an interesting one because his contract is up. So does he stick around? What does he cost on the market? Remains to be seen. But I think towards the end of the season he was really coming on strong, and the way that he was able to play next to Ed Oliver really seemed to open things up, and Ed Oliver really flourished throughout the full season. He had flashes, but I can't even count how many times we sat in on the show after the game. We're kind of like, man, it's not really in the stat sheet, but Ed Oliver was playing on fire again today. And I think that's kind of what you get out of Ed Oliver. And yes, I do think that we have I think we have seasons of Ed Oliver coming up where we might see like the 8 to 10 sack range, where he's just able to play a little bit more consistent with consistency next to him. But everything we were able to see from him at the end of the season, he was a guy that we had talked about that we really needed to see more from, and I think towards the end of the season he really started showing that. And we can sprinkle some other guys in here. F.A. Obata. He was injured. He was inactive. But in the snaps that he did get, I kind of like what he shows as a rotation piece. And there's a lot of talk about, will some of these defensive ends kind of reduce down to D tackle for pass rushing situations. And I think we saw that the most from him. And overall, in his limited snaps, I would say I'm pretty pleased with him, and I'd be glad to have him back. Boogie Basham, interesting case to me because he got more of that A.J. Vanessa treatment that I was expecting for Greg Rousseau this year. And he's, again, a player that, he had his weeks that he was inactive. He had weeks where he didn't really do much, but there's also some times where he was kind of popping off the screen, and I think of the idea of both him and Greg Rousseau and their pass rushing style, not necessarily just being like straight up beat you with speed and pass rush moves, but they're that kind of like, you get the quarterback 2-3 seconds in the pocket and they're just still grinding on your offensive linemen, and they work from whistle to whistle every play. So Basham is somebody I'm excited to see, kind of with more snaps, another off season of work, how these players get coached up, and if we do lose a Mario Addison or a Jerry Hughes, those snaps got to go to somebody, and with the extra workload for Vanessa, Basham, Rousseau, like what do we see these players start developing into? Vernon Butler, he can go. I know he's kind of a guy that we bet on his draft pedigree, and maybe we can be the ones to resurrect his career. You're paying him a real contract, and seeing him inactive, I feel like it's the Trent Murphy move all over again, and I always kind of get the idea on paper because Brandon Beane likes to fill out his roster before he goes into the draft, so you're not just chasing need. So I understand the process, but I feel like it also has the ability to rope us into some suspect contracts that we have to deal with down the road. And then one of the other thing that I'm optimistic and hopeful with in this group is Brandon Beane has made a commitment to the trenches on both sides of the ball year after year. And while we can look at the offensive line and kind of by the end of the year feel like we had something clicking there, I don't think he's satisfied with the defensive line as a whole as of right now. So part of my reason for optimism is I don't think he's done there yet. And I don't think this is a spot where we see, some big marquee free agent come in. The Twitter sphere goes crazy for like, oh, let's make a move for this year. It's Chandler Jones, Hassan Reddick, Von Miller. Last year it was J.J. Watt. I don't think we have the cap room to want to be making the swing at the plate like that. I think you could free up the cap if you wanted to try to make a move like that, but it also hampers everything else you can do. So I think this is going to be a spot where we see them draft defensive line again. We might see a D tackle go. We might see more DNs get brought in. I think this is definitely a position that a set of positions that Brandon Beane isn't done with addressing yet. And when you have some of the glaring weaknesses that we have along that defensive line, and you're still able to have the number one defense in the league, I think the fact that that's position is still on Brandon Beane's radar, and that's one of the areas that he's really focused on and committed into making better. I don't think he's going to stop until he gets there, and if you can add a legitimate top flight pass rush to this defense, to me it's just awesome and scary to think about what this defense can do as a total unit if you have that bona fide defensive line on the front end.